their different ways, the Gospel writers present accounts of the human political forces and how they aligned to bring about the execution by crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth, the Messiah. But the execution itself, in human terms, is a degrading failure. Not only has the kingly reign of God failed to materialize, yet again, the Messiah who was to bring this about has been tortured, humiliated, and shamefully executed in an act of political theatre that isn't even unusual. By the standards of the book of Deuteronomy, this is a cursed death. Cursed is he who hangs upon a tree. No wonder that Paul, preaching a gospel of Christ crucified, will say, for Jews a scandal, for non-Jews madness. It is at this part of the history, then, that the gospel writers use the Hellenistic practice of artful intertextuality in its densest form, in order to transform the meaning of what would otherwise be an entirely tragic narrative. The reader must be helped to see both how these events fulfill the scriptures and to glimpse divine action that brings healing and rescue to the world through the darkness. We've already seen how important are the Isaiah texts, which describe the suffering servant, especially the fourth of the so-called servant songs in Isaiah 53. One line in particular provides a direct answer to the scandal of the crucified Messiah. We thought of him as someone punished, struck by God and brought low. Yet he was pierced through for our faults, crushed for our sins. But we shall also see how all the gospel writers reference distress psalms, like Psalm 22, which begins, my God, why have you deserted me?" In Mark and Matthew, indeed, these will be Jesus' last words. Luke's Jesus will quote Psalm 31, "Into your hands I commend my spirit." John's Gospel quotes Psalm 69 right at the beginning, when Jesus clears the money changers out of the temple. In John's account of the Passion, Jesus' words, "I'm thirsty," are an active fulfillment of the same psalm. "When I was thirsty, you gave me vinegar to drink." As so often in this sort of writing, the fragments hinted at in the Gospel texts take the reader to a whole narrative in which the faithful and obedient servant of God laments the misfortune that surrounds them, puts their trust in God, and experiences rescue against all expectation. Not all distress psalms end on such a note of hope, but the three that I have just highlighted do. As ever, the discerning Christian reader is invited to recognize the divine prophetic narrative of promise and hope woven into the real and terrible human tragedy of the cross. We should begin as ever by looking at Mark's account, since the dramatic structure of his whole gospel most clearly points towards the events of the crucifixion. In Mark, Jesus is taken by the Roman soldiers directly from being scourged and mocked out to execution. He is unable to carry the crossbeam himself, and Simon from the North African province of Cyrene is dragged out of the crowd of passers-by as he comes in from the countryside and is forced to carry the beam on his behalf. Mark adds the detail that Simon is the father of Rufus and Alexander. Here Mark may be implying a direct connection between this incident and Christians known to his community. But Simon is also a living symbol in the narrative. He makes visible that other great theme of Mark's Gospel, the call to imitate the suffering and rejected Christ. Simon, albeit perforce, does indeed take up the cross and follow Jesus. If he was not a follower before, the implication is that he and his followers become followers afterwards. Mark's description of the procedure is succinct. They take him to an area just outside the city walls, but visible to passers-by, known in Aramaic as Golgotha, the place of the skull. A much later theologically motivated tradition will identify the skull as Adam's. but given that the place was clearly regularly used for public executions and had graves nearby, the name is not so surprising. Jesus refuses the drugged wine offered to dull the pain. The soldiers divide his clothes and cast lots for his garments. Not a surprising thing for soldiers to do, but Mark's words connect the description directly to Psalm 22. The time is 9 o'clock in the morning. It is full daylight. On the cross, and this is reported by all the gospel writers, is a mocking title, indicating the crime for which he has been charged, King of the Jews. But the mocking intention of the pagan executioners is subverted by the insight of the reader, who recognizes a truth guaranteed by the scriptures. Jesus is executed alongside two brigands, though Mark doesn't indicate whether the two are also being executed for political reasons. In the phrase, one on his right and one on his left, is there a pointed reference to the ambitious request of James and John on the road to Jerusalem to sit one on your right and one on your left in the kingdom of heaven? A reminder again of the cost of discipleship. Or is Mark simply reinforcing the message of Isaiah 53, letting himself be taken for a sinner? The passers-by insult him, shaking their heads, a description that blends echoes of Psalm 22 with themes from Jesus' trial. They toss their heads and sneer. From the psalm, "You are going to destroy and rebuild the temple. Save yourself," from the trial. The chief priests and scribes from the trial also reappear to echo themes from the trial, and now mockingly demand a definitive sign. Let the Christ, the King of Israel, come down from the cross. Then at midday comes the darkness. This is clearly significant for Mark, and in context provides a mysterious divine response to the mockery. An affirmation that what is taking place does indeed have cosmic significance. Some commentators have tried to explain this with an eclipse. However, since the Passover takes place at the time of the full moon, that explanation is misplaced. What is more important is that this description of a darkness over the whole land points us to two Tanakh texts. One is the Exodus narrative of the final plague of darkness that covers the whole land of Egypt, immediately before the Passover liberation of the Israelites. It points the reader towards the meaning of Jesus' death as an act of rescue by God, by the blood of the Passover lamb. The second is to a prophecy of Amos. That day it is the Lord who speaks. I will make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth in broad daylight. I will make it a morning like the morning for an only son. An affirmation that God is indeed at work at the heart of these events. And perhaps an affirmation of Jesus' divine sonship against the mockery of the elders. As the darkness clears at 3 o'clock, Jesus cries out in Aramaic the opening phrase of Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me?" His hearers misunderstand and think he is calling on the prophet Elijah, Eloi, heard as Eliah. Perhaps we should suppose that the mysterious darkness has renewed expectations among the onlookers that something great might after all be about to take place. Will the great prophet Elijah return from heaven in the winged chariot to rescue Jesus? They offer Jesus vinegar. Again, a hint of Psalm 69. They gave me vinegar to drink. But Jesus cries out and breathes his last. The last great cosmic sign takes place. The veil of the temple is torn in two from top to bottom. However, there is an ambiguity here. Does veil mean the veil dividing the incense altar off from the Holy of Holies in the inner temple? Or does it mean the veil described by Josephus, which separated the court of priests from the court of men? This second veil was a representation of the cosmos. a reminder that the rituals of the temple were bound up with upholding the cosmic order. How would we read the tearing of the veil? The tearing of the first veil might signify the end of any barrier between the glory of God and humanity. God is revealed at this very moment in the crucified Christ. That's certainly a message of St. Paul. For the Jews, the crucifixion is a scandal. For the non-Jews, nonsense. But for those who believe, it is the power and wisdom of God. Or should we read it as a tearing of the second veil, a symbol that the apocalyptic moment, the time of judgment, has come? The world as we know it and the temple and religious law that goes with it have indeed come to an end. Jesus' prophecy before the temple is fulfilled in the moment of his sacrificial death. Again, in the words of St. Paul, there is a new creation. The old world has passed away, and the new world has begun. It is the Gentile centurion who is able to read the signs and recognize what the high priest could not. When he sees how Jesus dies, his response is, "Truly this man was Son of God." There are layers of ambiguity here about what a non-Jew might or might not have meant by saying that. But this is the dramatic climax of the gospel, the moment of recognition anticipated at the very beginning of the gospel of Jesus, the Messiah, Son of God. After the catastrophe of the tragedy comes the wind down. For the first time we realize that the women who have accompanied Jesus from Galilee are standing, watching from a distance. They all have names. Now it is late on the day of the preparation for the Sabbath. For the first time we encounter Joseph of Arimathea, identified as a moderate counselor, someone who would have participated in the trial, and someone who was sympathetic to Jesus' message. The kingdom of God is at hand. Joseph asks Pilate if he can take the body. Pilate is surprised Jesus has died so quickly, but after checking with the centurion, allows the corpse to be handed over. Joseph buys a winding cloth, wraps the body and buries it in a rock tomb, sealed with a stone at the entrance. The two Marys, Mary Magdalene and Mary the wife of Josephus, observe where he has been put. These details are clearly important. They establish that Jesus was dead, that he was buried, that his body could not have left the tomb by any way other than the sealed door, and that there were witnesses. When we turn to Matthew's account, we find that he follows Mark very closely. However, he rounds out the story here and there and adds some elements which may be for the benefit of Jewish Christian readers in dialogue with skeptical fellow Jews. When the chief priests address Jesus, they now also quote Psalm 22 with its echo in the Book of Wisdom. He trusted in God. Let God deliver him if he so favors him. More significantly, as Jesus cries out in the darkness, Matthew makes a little more of the drama, as well as making it easier to understand how the bystanders thought he was calling Elijah. Instead of Mark's Aramaic Eloi, Mark has a more Hebrew-sounding Eli, which does sound much more like Elia. We see one person runs up to offer the sponge of vinegar, but the others try to hold him back, to wait and see if Elijah will come. In this dramatic pause, Jesus gives up his spirit, and the veil of the temple is torn, as in Mark. But now there is also an earthquake, and rocks are shattered, the tombs are opened, and the bodies of the holy ones who had fallen asleep were raised. This bit of narrative anticipates the time after Jesus' own resurrection, when they entered the holy city and were seen by many people. This extra drama extends the idea implicit in Mark that the end time has already come with the death of Jesus. The old order is passing away, and signs of the new creation are now visible. It also explains how it is that the centurion is able to recognize Jesus as a Son of God, though the motivation is now holy terror rather than the reverent awe that Mark seemed to imply. Matthew's list of women watching is slightly different from Mark's. Instead of Salome, we have the mother of James and John. It could, of course, have been called Salome. But more importantly, she has already played a role in Matthew's Gospel. Matthew is more succinct than Mark in his account of the burial of Jesus. Pilate shows no sign of surprise at Jesus' death. Remember, perhaps, Matthew's desire to avoid unnecessary, awkward questions, and simply gives the body to Joseph for burial. Matthew also adds an explanatory detail absent in Mark, that the tomb carved out of rock belonged to Joseph himself. He has the two Marys physically sitting opposite the tomb rather than just watching everything. But at this point he adds a further narrative element absent from all the other writers. The chief priests and Pharisees ask Pilate to put a guard around the tomb. They remember that Jesus had said he would rise in 3 days. They want to make sure that his disciples do not steal the body and then falsely claim that he has risen. Pilate agrees to this. The authorities get their guard and seal the tomb. There will be a mirror of this scene in Matthew's account of the resurrection morning. In the other Gospels, the women who come to the tomb find the stone moved away. In Matthew, there is another earthquake and an angel appears shining like lightning to roll the stone away. The watchguards are present at the scene, but faint in terror. So after the women have gone to bring the news of the resurrection to the disciples, the guards return to the city and report to the authorities, who bribe them to say that they fell asleep and the disciples stole the body. Matthew adds, and this is the way the Jews still tell the story today. His audience is clearly familiar with this alternative, skeptical account of the resurrection story, one that Christians, Jewish and non-Jewish, are presumably encountering in their engagement with the wider Jewish community. So Matthew's purpose with this coda is probably not so much to convince the unconvinced as to reassure Christian readers who might otherwise be disturbed by the dissonant voices of the critics, to enable them to embrace the gospel of the resurrection with peace of mind. Thank you for listening, and see you next episode.